Welcome to Heads Up HR, the podcast from QuestCover, bringing you the latest HR insights, legislation updates, and practical advice to keep your business compliant and your people supported. No jargon, no stress, just advice you can actually use, and the chance to be part of a workplace community that's learning and growing together. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Heads Up HR. As always, I'm your host, Perry Johnson, and I'm once again joined by the lovely Sophie Branner, our HR consultant. Hi Sophie, it's great to have you back on Heads Up HR. How are you?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me back.
It's wonderful to have you back. You know, we had such a strong response to your last episode. People really connected with how clearly you broke everything down. So it's brilliant to have you join us again, especially as we're going to dive into another really important topic for employers. It's a new era in terms of employment law. The Employment Rights Act has brought forth its first round of legislation changes earlier this month at the start of April, with future changes coming in October and further afield next year. There's a lot for employers to get their head around, a lot that they've probably heard, and it's quite a difficult time for employers to be aware of everything that's going on. Today, we wanted to take a slightly different angle and talk about when we're talking about the Employment Rights Act. We've had webinars speaking about, all the key details of the legislation changes in depth. But today, I wanted to take a slightly different angle when it comes to talking about the Employment Rights Act. We've covered in webinars all the key details, very in depth about all the legislation changes that are happening. But today, I don't want to kind of look at it from a technical or legal deep dive kind of way. I'm really keen to explore what this actually feels like for businesses right now. What's changing, what's uncertain, and where leaders might be feeling a bit of pressure or even overwhelmed. So you're somebody in a unique position working with Quest. You work with a lot of businesses. You're on the road, you go and visit them, you deliver training. So you speak to organisations day in, day out, and you're seeing firsthand how people are reacting to the changes. So I think it'd be really valuable for our listeners to hear what you're noticing on the ground.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly the right angle, because I think what's happening at the moment is a lot of the conversation is quite technical, but in reality, most organisations are trying to work out what it actually means for them day to day. What I'm seeing is less confusion about the law and more uncertainty about its interpretation, timing, and impact on people, processes and practices. So it's not just a compliance conversation anymore, it's becoming more leadership and culture conversation. In terms of what I'm seeing on the ground, there's a lot of uncertainty. This is a lot of change in a short period of time. So we've had changes coming in April with further changes coming later in the year. There's the practical challenge. Many organisations are, where do you start? What do you change first? What does good practice look like? So there's definitely some pressure for organisations with this change, but it's not necessarily panic. It's more of a low-level friction, kind of a background worry whether you're getting it right, and if you're not going to get it right, are you going to be reprimanded?
What are the risks? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think the risks always come into it for people that want to get it right, not just for the risks, not for complying, but also for their employees as well. They want to be able to support their employees while also supporting their business. So what would you say is your response when people share these concerns with you? What would you say to people? I know you've said that it's kind of a low level friction, but you also mentioned about them not knowing, what do I do first? There's kind of a slew of legislation changes that came into effect at the start of April. So is it kind of the case where they need to be making these changes all at once now, or can they do it in drips and drabs throughout the coming months in the build up to the next round of changes in October?
Yeah, so when it comes to the questions around the concern around all the changes that we're having, I really talk about breaking it down. So what's going to impact them the most? Yeah. So one of the changes we've seen is around SSP. Well, if you've got high absence already, then naturally that's a bit of a concern for you. So it might be that we focus on that first, and we break down what that absence process looks like and what we can do to support without making too much change, because people are already backed up in their day-to-day operational jobs. What I would say is policies need to be changed in line with the law as it's coming in place. It's important to have that in. If we waited until later in the year, that's a lot to be communicating out to employees. Yeah. So ensuring that you have the policies updated as and when the changes come in is really important.
Yeah, but I suppose in the same breath, it's also it's needs-based as well. In the way it depends on the size and scale of your business as well. I suppose for kind of smaller businesses with smaller management teams, I suppose the policy side of things is more important, and making sure that obviously all the employees within the business are aware of the policies. But for bigger organisations with a lot of different line managers, it's about making sure that the line managers are aware of the changes so that they can communicate effectively down the line. So is that also kind of what you're seeing, that is very much a needs-based, depending on the size of the business?
Absolutely. And how an organisation approaches these changes will absolutely depend on the type of business they are, the risks. Going back to my example of, having that panicked conversation. Well, if you've got an absence problem already, then naturally you need to deal with that first.
And now a word from one of our partners.
We are proud to partner with Quest on this episode of Heads Up HR. Black Country Chamber of Commerce is the leading business support organisation for the Black Country region. We champion local businesses, drive economic growth and connect members through networking, advocacy and practical support. Through our partnership with Quest, our members can tap into expert advice, resources and guidance that make managing people safer, simpler and smarter. It's great to see Heads Up HR helping businesses across the UK do just that. To find out more about how we support businesses like yours, visit www.blackcountrychamber.co.uk.
And now back to the episode. Yeah, I think the sickness pay change in particular is the one that's probably causing the most kind of ripples for employers, because there's already been a growing increase in the number of people taking sickness absence leave. For example, the CIPD in their health and wellbeing report at work report found that UK employees take an average of 9.4 days of sickness absence per year, highest level in over 15 years, and comparatively to pre-pandemic, that was 5.8 working days per year. So quite a drastic increase in that. So it's possibly an issue that a lot of businesses are currently facing anyway.
Yeah.
So having this change come in would naturally cause a lot of worry for employers.
Yeah,
so
I think it's likely to increase further.
Yeah.
I mean, some of these changes with this increase come down to, we know there's been an increase in health and wellbeing, managing mental health.
Yeah.
So that is a factor, but I definitely think this change from April will make a further increase to those numbers. How you manage your absence will become even more important with that. There is genuine absence.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is kind of stress related. We've seen a growing awareness of that and a kind of reason being given. Around 64% of employers actually report stress related absences. So it's an issue impacting a lot of businesses. So it's about supporting the employees' well-being, trying to, if they're reporting that they're feeling stressed, trying to reduce that, and taking kind of a more empathetic approach towards managing sickness absence than, I imagine some people are quite hardline and thinking, they're throwing a sickie or X, Y, Z, but it's real pressures that a lot of employees are facing. So it's how employers can support that in order to keep their levels down.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to think of the other side of this. These businesses are operating. If they've got large level of absences, then that does need to be managed as well. So yeah, you have to look at both sides. People are trying to balance day-to-day operation demands. Where you've got a high absence level, that puts further pressure on that operational demand that's already there. So you have to empathise with both sides. Yes, there's genuine absences, but also a business is trying to operate too. Yeah. So it can be a strain on both sides.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's balancing that's where the challenge comes in, really. So building on from that point, are there any kind of themes emerging in terms of where organisations feel less prepared or even just unsure about what's coming next? Yeah,
so I think the biggest gap isn't necessarily awareness. So using SSP for an example, SSP is already in place. It's just the change is from day one being paid. Most organisations know that change is coming. It's more about the confidence to implement it, to manage it and put it into your processes. So it's not that organisations don't care, it's that they're already stretched. We just talked around the operational day-to-day, that they're already having to deliver their day roles. So change feels like something layered on top of this. As I said earlier, it isn't, think about the things that you already have in place. Okay, so this is not about putting loads of change in place. You might actually have a really good policy already that actually again, using SSP, for example, the only thing you're actually changing in there is this is now paid from day one. Your process doesn't effectively change. Same with family-friendly rights for paternity, day one. Again, your policy doesn't change in how you manage it. You are just changing that this is now a day one right.
Yeah. So I suppose it's a lot of people kind of, you hear about the changes and it's kind of blown up as this big thing, but then when it comes to it, it can be made a lot more simpler.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that, you know, it's that balancing act, and we need to try to you know, ensure that people aren't panicking at the changes. At the end of the day, they're being brought in for reasons to you know, benefit workplaces and employees.
Yeah, and when I'm speaking to companies, once you start breaking it down, it doesn't feel as scary.
Yeah.
You know, yes, there is a lot of change, absolutely, with the law. However, actually, if you really go into it, it's not too dissimilar to what's already in place. But this is where training becomes really important, because it's not necessarily about understanding the legislation, but translating it into day-to-day practice. So how are we always ensuring we're doing a return to work? Because that is one of the things that deters absenteeism, checking in on your employees. So training is really useful for this. As I said, not talking about the ins and outs of the law and, you know, what act does it sit under, but more of what does it look like for a day-to-day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that kind of related to the changes to SSP is, as well, there's a new requirement for record keeping. So, you know, it's really important for managers to be keeping records of SSP or any kind of leave, or, you know, any practices they're doing for up to 6 years. Quite a big change. And then one of the other changes that I wanted to pick up on is actually not one that's come into effect yet. It's one that's proposed from 2027 onwards, about the protection from unfair dismissal. But I think it's an important point to highlight that it does impact any employees hired from July this year onwards. So it is another change that, even though it's not coming into effect until later down the line, in terms of on the ground, real managing employees, it is going to start impacting new hires from 1st of July onwards. So I just kind of, what do employees need to be aware of in relation to that?
So in terms of the change, it's anybody with 6 months service or more that can claim for an unfair dismissal as of January 27. As you've just said, that affects from July, because the period that a claim can be made is also being extended to 6 months and 1 day, hence why it is affected so early. One of the key things I would say is that probationary process becomes really important. So how are we managing it early on? How are we keeping a record? So I always say good practice after 4 weeks, or after they've come out their training, having a check-in with them. How are they getting on? Again, 3 months down the line, and then at the 6 months. So before that period even hits, I would say that's the most important thing that I've been discussing with companies in relation to the changes. But also outside of that 6 months, then how are we managing, again, following our processes and procedures? One of the things that the tribunal will look at is, have they followed their own processes and procedures that are in place? So it's important that that is being followed and we are keeping a record. This isn't about having, you know, pages and pages of documents. It can be follow-up emails, you know, the return to work documents, for example, referencing back to the SSP. Policies and procedures being followed, and probationary process nailed down. Yeah,
so I mean, the changes, in a way, if you break them down and look at them separately and individually, it seems like quite a lot, but they feed into each other quite naturally in some aspects. Like you're saying, with the record keeping being important when it comes to that future change.
And I think with this, again, this isn't new things. We should already be managing people within their probationary period.
Yeah.
We should already be taking record of people's sickness absence. We just need to keep it for a bit longer now. So these aren't necessarily new. We just need to be consistent with them. Yeah,
and tweaking them. I mean, I think, you know, a lot of businesses are also reducing the probation period that they're having. You know, they may have previously had 6 months, and now in light of the changes, reducing that down to 3 or 4 months. So in that sense, it's kind of, everything stays the same. You're just reducing the time frame for it and making sure that you're keeping everything that was being seen at, you know, maybe on the 3rd month, 4th month, just reducing that down as well to 6 weeks in, or 8 weeks, or
Yeah, I mean, my advice would probably differ from other HR professionals. I'm just going to say that. But I actually think the 6 months probationary is better, because actually you have to think that employee is in training for part of that probationary. So are we really seeing them within that 3 months? Because a part of that is a training period.
Yeah.
So I think that slightly longer probationary period is better. Don't forget, they can be signed off their probationary earlier than that 6 months, but at least it gives you further opportunity to review their performance, how they're fitting in with their team, the conduct. But as I said, other professionals may disagree with that point.
Yeah, but I suppose I see your point as well, because if you're giving them a shorter window, there's kind of, you're not going to see the ins and outs so much as you would over a 6 month period. For example, you'd be able to kind of pick up on, there's a slight issue there, or there's a slight issue here, or, this is really working well, this is really working well. So I think it just gives you more scope to identify the performance and keep checking in. I think with a longer probation period, it's also important to check in regularly throughout that probation period, not just kind of say, here you are, here's your training, and then 6 months down the line say, how's everything going?
Absolutely.
I think regular check-ins and communication is important.
Absolutely, and we shouldn't be waiting until the last minute where we go, Sophie's not been very good, and we decide in 5 months and 2 weeks down the line to manage it. We should be, as you've just said, having those check-ins as early as possible, to pick up the issue early rather than wait until the last minute.
Yeah, and I suppose it's also about kind of, even if there aren't any issues with performance or any concerns with performance, it's also how they're feeling, how the employee's feeling within the role and how they're finding it and managing it, and whether there's any causes for concern from their perspective, even if there aren't any from the employers.
Absolutely, because that helps you retain that employee as well.
Yeah, 100%. So I think that kind of covers all of the main key legislation that I wanted to talk about. But I think a lot of our listeners will be in that position of trying to balance doing the right thing for their people while also managing business realities. And that's not always straightforward. I think it could create a bit of a kind of tension there for an employer, trying to balance that both sides. So kind of what would your guidance be for anyone feeling that way?
Yeah, I'd say that tension is absolutely right. It's definitely one of the things I'm feeling being out there.
Yeah.
People want to do the right thing by the employee, but the reality is as well, they have to run the operation and the business. So it is a really hard balancing act. I know I've said this a couple of times, but a lot of this just needs breaking down into things you already have where there's been minor changes. I would say people aren't necessarily resisting the change. It's more the practical about how will I embed it? How will I make that change? It feels like a lot. But I would take it in bites. Think about your type of business. As you've referenced, those smaller businesses, yes, the policies and procedures are the bread and butter of starting to implement this because it's what they rely on. Some of those larger companies who have large management teams, actually, how are you putting things in place to support the managers to make them aware of the processes and policies that are in place? Or
that will be in place further down the line if you're doing training beforehand. Absolutely. So, well, I think that kind of wraps up this particular episode of Heads Up HR. And, hopefully for all the listeners out there, by the end of this, people are feeling a little less alone in navigating all the changes, a little less pressure on them to navigate all the changes. As we've said, take it in steps. Quest is here to support anyone going through the changes or trying to implement the changes. So reach out to Quest if you're an existing client, or just want to reach out to see the kind of support that is available through us. We are very much a needs-based business. So like you're saying, with smaller businesses, their needs are very different to large business. The support that Quest offers is also follows that line. So even if there isn't a neat one-size-fits-all solution, Quest is here to support you. So yeah, thank you, Sophie, for a really informative breakdown of what you're seeing out there on the road after these legislation changes have come into effect.
Thank you for having me. Just one final thought. If there's one takeaway, it's probably that it's okay not to have everything fully mapped out. There is a lot of change, but it is worth being intentional about how you're approaching it.
Yeah, absolutely. Having that plan in place going forward. Yeah, I think that is really important. So thank you, Sophie. I'm sure we'll have you on a future episode breaking down things for us once again. And thank you everyone for tuning in and listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of Heads Up HR. That's all for this episode of Heads Up HR. Thanks for joining us. Be sure to follow and share the podcast, and we'll be back soon with more HR updates and insights from Quest Cover.